I am Isabella, 28 years old, and Christmas used to be my favorite holiday. Growing up in the Harper family meant extravagant celebrations, but as the black sheep with a jewelry business instead of a corporate career, I always tried harder to fit in. Last December, I arrived early to help with preparations when I overheard a conversation that shattered everything. My own parents had planned to humiliate me at Christmas dinner and clear out my childhood bedroom while I sat there unaware. Before we dive into this story, let me know where you are watching from and hit that like and subscribe button if you have ever had to choose between family expectations and your own happiness. The Harpers of Greenwich, Connecticut were known for three things: money, influence, and expectations so high they could crush you. My father, Thomas Harper, built his investment firm from the ground up, a success story polished for magazine features. My mother, Diane, came from old money and treated reputation like a personal collection. Jordan, my brother, followed perfectly in our father's footsteps, while Amanda, my sister, became the corporate attorney our parents proudly bragged about at their country club gatherings. And then there was me, the one who was supposed to complete the perfect family trifecta, but instead became the disappointment. Since childhood, the plan had been clear: earn a prestigious degree in law or finance, then join either the family firm or a company impressive enough to be mentioned at their dinner parties. I dutifully attended Columbia University, but during my sophomore year, a single metalwork elective changed everything. For the first time, I felt alive, creating with my hands. By senior year, instead of applying to law schools, I was selling my handcrafted jewelry at campus events. The family reaction was swift and severe. My father refused to speak to me for 3 months. My mother quietly arranged meetings with family friends in law firm recruitment as if I could still be redirected. My siblings alternated between awkward silence and lectures about throwing away my potential. Yet I graduated, used my savings to rent a tiny studio apartment in Brooklyn, and set up my first workshop. I ate ramen for months, worked 16-hour days, and slowly built Isabella Designs from nothing. 5 years later, my pieces were carried in boutiques across New York and New Jersey. I was making a comfortable living doing what I loved, though in my parents' world, none of that counted as real success. That night, as I stepped into their perfectly decorated house, I still carried a small hope that this Christmas might be different. The place looked like a magazine spread: precise lights, matched wreaths, 2 perfect trees at the door. Inside, the air smelled like cinnamon layered over fresh paint. A new runner lined the hallway of framed proof, promotions, awards, and the photos that told the story my parents preferred. I reminded myself that I wasn't a guest in their narrative. I had my own. I carried a box of gifts I had made: cufflinks shaped by the typography of my father's first business card, a pendant for my mother with the flowers she once loved before board seats replaced gardens, and matching bracelets for my siblings with small symbols from the years when we were only children and not roles. I had written notes to explain meaning, not to beg for approval. In rooms arranged like sets, I sensed a program more rigid than usual. The kitchen looked like an event control room: glassware in lines, a printed timeline, staff moving as if timed to music. I felt the outline of a role prepared for me, something tidy and ornamental. I told myself I was imagining it and promised to stay steady, to offer what I brought, and to leave if respect was not part of the plan. I set my bag in the guest room that used to be mine and listened to the house. The sounds of planning carried through walls: schedules, seating, numbers. I thought it was the usual choreography of appearances. I didn't yet know that numbers were being gathered for me, not for catering, and that the seat I was meant to fill was not for celebration, but for correction. I stepped into the hallway with my gift box and the kind of hope that still shows up even after it has been told to leave. I believed I could handle a performance. I did not expect to hear the script. I left the gift box on the dresser and walked the corridor that led to my father's study. I told myself I was only going to say hello, to choose the kindest version of the evening before it chose me. Halfway there, I heard my name in a tone I knew too well. I stopped without deciding to stop. The door was not fully closed. It offered a thin line of sound and certainty. I recognized my father's voice first. He said that my jewelry business was not a future, only a phase that had gone on too long. He added that he wanted me to hear facts, not feelings. He said that Christmas dinner would be the right setting because family pressure could do what private conversations had not. Jordan answered in the measured cadence he used for presentations. He said that he had invited a financial advisor named Stephen to prepare a comparison. He explained that Stephen would show how a corporate salary would outweigh what he called my unpredictable sales. He said that after the main course, he would introduce the numbers and recommend a path that made sense for the family image. My mother sounded organized, like she was reading from an event plan. She said that the intervention should be brief and neat. She suggested that my father open with concern, that Jordan run the numbers, and that my sister close by guiding me toward an opening at the firm. She said that a marketing role could save me from embarrassment and finally align me with the family. Amanda agreed with a kind of satisfaction that shrank the room. She said that I had mistaken online followers for proof and that Christmas would correct the story. She suggested that a gentle but firm tone would be best, the way a teacher speaks to a student who refuses to study. Uncle Robert asked whether a public intervention at dinner was necessary. He said that humiliation did not convince. It only hardened. He wondered if a private talk would be kinder. The silence after his words felt like a wall. Then my mother resumed her plan as if his concern were background noise. I heard my father mention that, while everyone ate, the staff would begin clearing my old bedroom. He said that space was needed and that keeping a shrine to childhood encouraged me to believe I could live in two worlds. He called the clearing practical. My mother called it symbolic. Amanda called it overdue. Jordan outlined numbers in a way meant to sound neutral. He said that based on my apartment size and lifestyle, my annual income likely hovered around a figure that would look small on a slide. He said that Stephen would contrast that with the starting pay for a junior role. He said that the difference would be persuasive, because money spoke a language I would finally hear. My mother added a metaphor that landed like frost. She said that my pieces were sweet refrigerator art, cute in a season, but not the kind of work that builds a life. She said that everyone would understand that analogy and that it would soften the blow. I understood that she believed kindness and condescension were the same thing. I stood very still, holding my breath like evidence. The study smelled faintly of leather and old paper, the kind of room that forgives its occupants everything. It did not forgive me. I listened until I knew there was nothing more to rescue from their plan. They had assigned me a role and rehearsed my lines. I was meant to sit, to nod, to accept the rescue I had never asked for. I walked back the way I had come, quieter than the carpet. In the guest room, I closed the door and leaned against it. I thought about the months I had worked in the index of night, shaping metal until it obeyed a drawing that only I could see. I thought about clients who saved for a piece because it carried a story they wanted to wear. I thought about the ledger I had built line by line, not grand, but solid. I did not cry immediately. First, I named things. I said to myself that what I had heard was control presented as care. I said that the plan at dinner was not a conversation. It was a verdict. I said that clearing my room during the meal was not logistics. It was erasure. Only then did the tears come, clean and brief, like rain that washes the air enough to see the road. I sat at the small desk and opened a blank page. I wrote that I would not attend a performance staged against me. I wrote that I would not argue with a spreadsheet curated to prove what it started out believing. I wrote that I would choose a different room, a different table, a different kind of family for the night ahead. And I underlined it once, the way you mark metal before you cut, a line that becomes shape. I sat on the edge of the guest bed and felt the night press against my ribs. The house moved in polished rhythms outside my door, but inside I finally let my shoulders drop. I told myself that what I had heard was not concern, it was a script written without me. I reminded myself that humiliation planned on a timeline was still humiliation, no matter how they dressed it. I washed my face and watched the water carry away the shine meant for photographs. I thought about the version of me they preferred, the one who smiled on cue and accepted a rescue that would cost me my life. I decided I would not perform that version, not even for one course of dinner. I reached for my phone. I called the one person who knew the shape of my work and the weight it took to make it. When my friend picked up, I heard the sound of a normal room in the background, a door closing, a chair moving, the small music of a place where I was safe. She said she had been thinking about me and asked if I had arrived. I said I had, and I told her what I had overheard in the study. I spoke as evenly as I could, one piece at a time, like laying tools on a bench and naming them. She listened without rushing and said that none of the numbers I described sounded like truth. She reminded me that I had a wait list for custom work, that last month I had turned down a wholesale order because I refused to cut quality, and that my books showed steady growth because I had learned to plan, not to hope. She said that what I had heard was not analysis, it was a performance dressed as math. Hearing her say it stabilized the floor beneath me. I told her that the part about my room being cleared during dinner felt like the final lesson they wanted to teach me. She said it sounded like a punishment for refusing a path that was never mine. She suggested that I choose a different table for Christmas and offered her place without hesitation. I thanked her and said I needed one night to think, then added that I already knew the answer. After we ended the call, I opened my laptop. I reread the email from the national retailer that had been waiting for an answer. I had delayed because I was afraid of growing too fast and losing the integrity of my work. The message invited me to design a capsule collection for spring, with support for production and a feature on their platform. I pictured the sketches already pinned to my wall, the pieces that wanted to exist. I wrote a short reply asking for a meeting in January to confirm quantities and timelines. I hit send and felt a quiet click inside my chest, like a setting falling into place. I began a list in a notebook I kept for hard nights. I wrote that I would not attend the dinner. I wrote that I would arrange a delivery of the gifts I had made so that my meaning would arrive even if I did not. I wrote that I would plan a small gathering with friends, that I would move through the next days with care, that I would not explain my decision more than once. I added a practical line about my childhood things and how to request access to collect them after the holiday. The list looked plain and steady. It did not require anyone else to agree. I stood and opened the box of gifts again. I checked clasps and settings with the same attention I used in the studio, because work done right calms the hands that do it. I tucked the notes under the ribbon of each box and imagined them being opened. I did not imagine reactions. I had finally understood that my work was not a referendum on my worth. I put on my coat and stepped into the hall. The house hummed with preparations, the same hum that used to invite me to try harder. I walked to the back stairs and left the way I had entered that afternoon, carrying only my bag and the decision I had made. The night air felt clean, cold, and honest. I drove to my apartment in a lane of quiet cars and let the city receive me. Inside, I turned on the small tree I had decorated with leftover ribbon and thin wire stars. I sat on the floor and let the room remind me of the life I had built. A bench scored with hours of work, trays of stones arranged by color and clarity, shelves holding orders that would become stories on other people's skin. I did not rehearse an argument or compose a speech for later. Instead, I set an alarm for the morning, wrote down 3 tasks for the next day, and promised myself that I would move gently but firmly through each one. I knew there would be calls, and I knew what I would say, that I would not attend a performance written against me, that I had made other plans, and that my decision was final. When the alarm light blinked softly on my nightstand, I lay back and breathed until the room quieted. I told myself that choosing a different table was not a betrayal, it was a beginning. Morning arrived like a clean edge. I woke before the alarm, made coffee, and opened the notebook from the night before. The list stared back at me without drama. I added times beside each step and drew small boxes to check when finished. Structure steadied me more than sleep. I called my therapist first. I explained that I had overheard a plan designed to fold me back into a life that never fit. I summarized the intervention, the numbers curated to shame, the decision to clear my old room while everyone ate. She listened and named it clearly as emotional control dressed as concern. She suggested a short framework for the day: protect my body, protect my time, protect my work. She advised that I speak in single sentences, not arguments, and reminded me that boundaries do not require consensus. The session ended with a simple suggestion: Decide what I would do if no one agreed with me. Then do exactly that. I wrote 3 phrases on an index card and slid it into my pocket. I won't attend the dinner. My gifts will arrive tonight. We can talk after the holidays by email. I practiced saying them in my head without apology. I decided they would be the only lines I would use. Next, I addressed the practical knot of my childhood things. I called a lawyer friend who understood property and personalities. I described the plan to empty my room and asked how to keep my history from becoming a donation box. She proposed a certified letter stating that I did not abandon any personal property and intended to retrieve specific items after the holiday break, preferably with staff present. She offered sample language I could adapt. I thanked her and told myself that clarity could be a kind of kindness, even when the other person called it defiance. I drafted the letter slowly, listing what mattered: journals, photo albums, early tools, small sculptural studies from college. I kept the tone cool and factual, dated it, and arranged same-day mailing with tracking. I copied the file into a folder labeled Records. Paper felt heavier than memory in a way that helped. I turned to logistics for the evening. I contacted a boutique delivery service that specialized in personal presentations. I explained that the packages needed to arrive at a specific window during cocktail hour and asked for a discreet approach. The owner replied promptly and described how they would announce each name, present the box, and step back. He noted that timing mattered and promised precision. I confirmed the plan and added the pickup address for the afternoon. I included each note card I had written for the boxes and made sure the handwriting was clear. I texted my friends next. I wrote that I would not be at my parents' dinner and was planning a quiet Christmas Eve elsewhere. I received quick replies that felt like steady hands: offers of a spare room, food to share, firewood waiting. A friend mentioned a cabin 2 hours away that would sit warm by late afternoon if I wanted it. I accepted and promised to bring ingredients and a playlist that wouldn't exhaust the room. I marked the drive time on my list and blocked the hours as if they were a client appointment. At midday, I walked to the studio table and checked the gifts again. I cleaned each piece with a soft cloth, tightened a clasp, and retied a ribbon that looked impatient. Work obeyed when I paid attention to it. It was the one part of my life that did not punish me for being exact. I wrote a brief email to the national retailer confirming our January meeting, included 2 lines about the capsule concept, and asked for their production timelines. I kept it professional and warm. When their acknowledgement arrived minutes later, I filed it in the spring collection folder and felt the day tilt towards something like momentum. The calls from my family began shortly after. My phone vibrated with names that usually meant I should brace. I reminded myself of the index card. I answered, kept my voice even, and used only the sentences I had chosen. I said that I would not attend the dinner. I added that the gifts would arrive in the evening. I offered email after the holiday. I did not argue when disappointment was described as concern. I did not negotiate when consequences were floated like weather. I ended each call politely and checked another box in my notebook. It felt mechanical in the best way, a series of small, repeatable moves. By late afternoon, I had mailed the letter, scheduled the pickup, packed an overnight bag, and turned off lights in rooms that had watched me build a life one order at a time. Before leaving, I stood in the doorway of my studio and looked at the bench where so many pieces had learned their shape from my hands. I told myself that the bench was a better witness than any dinner table. The delivery team arrived on time, dressed in dark coats that looked like trust. I handed over the stack of labeled boxes and repeated the hour, the address, the tone. They confirmed each detail only once and drove away with my small biographies wrapped in velvet. I watched the taillights disappear and felt something unclasp inside my chest. I locked the door, carried my bag to the car, and set the navigation for the cabin. The city thinned into quieter roads. Snow waited in the forecast, the gentle kind that mutes edges and gives everything softer borders. I breathed with the engine's rhythm and thought about how revenge had shifted shape for me. It was no longer a spectacle. It was a schedule I kept, a boundary I honored, a set of papers that said I belonged to my own life. I arrived just before sunset. Smoke curled from the chimney, and warm light moved across the windows. When the door opened, I stepped into a room where no one wanted me to shrink. I set the bag down and felt the house receive me like a promise I had finally kept to myself. The cabin held the kind of warmth that doesn't need volume. My friends moved easily around the kitchen, trading tasks without ceremony. Someone handed me an apron with a grin that said, "Welcome, not rescue." I set ingredients on the counter and let the evening assemble itself. No one asked for a performance. They asked how I wanted my tea. We cooked the way families do when they remember how to be kind. One person chopping, another stirring, someone telling a small story about an almost burned pie that became a favorite recipe. I noticed how laughter here never arrived as evaluation. It simply arrived. The table filled with simple food and plates that did not match. I felt my heartbeat slow to the pace of ordinary time. I checked my phone only once to confirm that the delivery team had reached the street on schedule. The message arrived at the exact minute promised. They said the house looked like a photograph, that guests were gathering with drinks, and that the timing for presentations would be perfect. I thanked them and put the phone face down. My plan did not need me to hover, it needed me to trust. While the roast rested, we carried dishes to the table. I placed a small linen pouch at each setting, my own tradition when I could convince people to accept it. Inside each pouch was a simple charm in recycled silver, a tiny pine cone for patience, a hammered circle for continuity, a seed for beginnings. I said nothing. I believed meaning works best when it finds its own volume. We ate without announcements. Conversation moved like a river that knows its banks. When someone asked what I wanted from the next year, I spoke in nouns, not performances. Time, steadiness, tools. A friend said she heard space inside each word and that it sounded like a studio with more light. I stored that sentence the way I store a rare stone, for later setting. At the edge of dessert, my phone buzzed again. The delivery team reported that they had stepped through the front door at cocktail hour, announced each recipient by name, and handed over the boxes with a bow. They wrote that the room had shifted, that silence had weight, and that a few faces looked like questions without answers. They added that your grandmother's eyes softened when she lifted the lid. I breathed out for the first time in an hour. A cousin texted next. She said the boxes were stunning and that she never knew I worked at this level. She added that the note tucked under the ribbon made something inside her ache in a way she could not explain in a crowded room. I pictured the bracelet I had made for her, 3 thin strands braided like a promise, and hoped it would sit softly on her wrist. Another message arrived from an aunt who rarely chose my side. She wrote that she had read my note twice, and that the line about respect being the first clasp would stay with her. She said that my mother had tried to call the delivery dramatic, and that my grandmother had replied, in the way only grandmothers can, that craft is not a stunt. I smiled at the table and said that someone had just paid me the best compliment of my year. No one asked for details. They simply raised their glasses as if to let the compliment land. Between messages, candles shortened. We cleared plates and shifted to the living room. A friend brought out a box of plain wooden ornaments and a tray of paints. She said it had become her own tradition to mark a truth from the year with color and shape. I chose a small crescent of wood and painted a door with light pooling just beyond its threshold. I told them, in indirect words, that it represented choosing the room where I could breathe. Someone said that looked like relief in pigment. Another text arrived, this time from my brother. He wrote that he did not agree with a public intervention and that the numbers presented tonight were not numbers so much as a story dressed as arithmetic. He said he had admired the cufflinks quietly before anyone else noticed the serif hidden inside the metal, and that he knew exactly which card I had referenced. He added that he was ready to hear more about my work when I was ready to speak. I read the message twice, then put the phone away. Small doors open without noise. Snow began in a steady veil. We pulled blankets over our knees and let the fire translate the cold. My friends asked about the capsule collection only once. I said that a January meeting felt like the right speed, and that integrity would set the production limits. They nodded the way makers nod, an agreement to protect the shape of a thing from any pressure that would warp it. Near midnight, I stepped onto the porch with a mug between my hands. The trees wore a thin silver edge. I thought about each gift as it was opened across town. My father turning over the weight of his past in a pair of cufflinks. My mother recognizing a flower she had abandoned for a calendar. My siblings brushing a fingertip across a symbol from a shared childhood that was not a performance. I did not imagine apologies. I imagined understanding arriving like snow, soft, cumulative, unavoidable. Inside, someone had cued a quiet song. We exchanged the small linen pouches and grinned at the charms as if they were proof of a pact none of us had to sign. I realized that what I had always wanted from Christmas was not spectacle, but a room where care outnumbered corrections. Before sleep, I wrote a final note in my notebook. The gifts landed. The room shifted. Choose steadiness again tomorrow. I drew one small box next to the sentence and checked it. The mark looked ordinary, almost too plain to matter. But I knew what it meant. Revenge had done its work without raising its voice. Snow traced the window like careful handwriting. Morning in the cabin was quiet, the kind that lets thoughts line up without crowding. I made tea and opened my notebook to the page with boxes I had checked the night before. The list still worked. I added one more line. Hold my lines, no matter the volume on the other end. I kept the index card in my pocket, the one with 3 sentences that had become my anchor. I won't attend the dinner. My gifts will arrive tonight. We can talk after the holidays by email. I read them once out loud to the empty kitchen, not as a threat, but as a boundary I owed myself. The first call came mid-morning. The name on the screen had the familiar weight of a door that never opens all the way. I answered and used the first sentence. On the other side, words arrived fast and crowded, the way water does when a dam cracks. I heard that attendance was not optional, that family comes first, that I would make people worry if I stayed away. I held my breath and repeated the sentence once, the way a climber tests a foothold before trusting it. I added the second sentence about the gifts, then the third about email. I kept my voice low and even. The call ended with the kind of silence that pretends to be disappointment while reaching for control. I put the phone face down and washed a plate that wasn't dirty. The rhythm helped. A friend passed behind me and rested a hand on my shoulder for a second that said everything without questions. The cabin stayed warm. The second call arrived just after noon. I used the same 3 lines. The response came wrapped as concern, a reminder that opportunities had been arranged for me, that a marketing position could keep me from future embarrassment, that the intervention was meant to protect me from myself. I named it in my head as choreography and refused to dance. I kept to my sentences. When consequences appeared, subtle, vague, shaped like weather, I pictured my ledger, my orders, my keys on their hook. I already lived without whatever was being threatened. The call ended, not with understanding, but with a note to think carefully. I had already done that. I made lunch with my friends and let small tasks anchor me, slicing oranges, buttering bread, refilling a bowl with olives. Every useful motion felt like a vote. Between motions, I checked my email. A polite confirmation from the retailer sat there like good posture. Meeting locked, call sheet scheduled, sample timeline attached. I filed it into the spring collection folder and watched the cursor blink into stillness. In the afternoon, I walked outside and let snow cool my face. The trees were a library of white branches. I told myself that not attending the dinner was not an attack. It was a refusal to play a scripted part. Choosing absence where I was miscast was a kind of presence in my own life. That thought felt simple and correct. Back inside, I wrote one more note on the index card. No explanations beyond the 3 lines. It wasn't that I lacked reasons. I had 1,000. But I had learned that explanations feed arguments, and I had decided to be done arguing about my right to live a life that fit. Late afternoon brought the third call. I heard that my absence would create a scene, that guests would ask questions, that my grandmother would be disappointed, that the caterer needed final numbers. The list sounded like logistics pretending to be love. I repeated my 3 lines and added a 4th in my head. I am not a seat to be filled. I did not say it out loud. Not every truth needs air to be true. After the calls, I opened the delivery update. The service confirmed that the boxes were already staged for the evening route, ribbons checked, names verified. They promised a precise arrival at cocktail hour. I replied with a simple thank you and a request that they note the importance of tone. No flourish, no speeches, only presence and exit. They said they understood. I believed them. As sunset thinned the day, the living room gathered us without effort. We folded napkins, set out plates, and lit candles with the attention people give to small holy things. A friend asked if I wanted music or quiet. I said I wanted whatever would keep us breathing. Someone chose a playlist that moved like walking pace. Just before the hour I had planned, messages began to arrive. A cousin wrote that an unusual hush had followed each presentation, a pause that felt heavier than any toast. An aunt said the notes were beautiful and that boundaries could be kind when they were honest. She added that my grandmother had called the bracelet work worthy of the word work. I sat down on the arm of a chair and let those words rest on my ribs. Another message reported that my mother had called the timing theatrical and that my father had suggested the boxes be opened later. The delivery team had already left by then. There was no one to redirect. The house I had left so many times without air was now full of mine, carried in velvet, saying what I refused to shout. Dinner at the cabin was steady. We passed dishes without commentary and let satisfaction arrive without ceremony. I looked around the table and saw faces that asked for nothing more than what each person could give. It struck me that this was the opposite of humiliation, a setting where dignity didn't need to be defended. After we ate, I stepped onto the porch again. Snow stitched the night into one piece. Somewhere across town, a performance was missing its main character, and discovering it could still go on, just not the way it had been written. Inside my pocket, the index card had softened at the corners from being held. I slid it out, checked the 3 lines with my thumb, and realized I didn't need them at this exact moment. I had already said them. I had meant them. They had held. When I went back inside, a friend handed me a mug and nodded toward the fire. The room made space for me without noise. I sat, warmed my hands, and felt a truth arrive without ceremony. Sometimes the quietest revenge is simply keeping your plans and letting other people hear their own echoes. Night settled the way snow settles on branches, quietly, until the shape changes. In the cabin, we stacked plates and let the fire do the talking. Across town, a different room tried to hold its shine. I didn't need to imagine details. My phone began to carry them to me in small, careful sentences. A cousin wrote first. She said the boxes had arrived during cocktails and that the room had paused in a way she had never seen there. She added that people were pretending to keep talking while actually listening for a cue. She concluded that the silence felt heavier than crystal. I pictured the foyer lights reflected in polished floors and let her words stand in for the scene. An aunt who rarely texted me sent a line that sounded like a hand placed on a table. She said my note had been firm without anger and that the bracelet felt like memory held still. She added that my mother had called the timing theatrical, that my father had suggested waiting until later to open anything, and that my grandmother had already lifted the lid and settled the question. I read the message twice and filed it inside my ribs like a small, warm thing. Then came an update from the delivery service. They reported that each name had been announced softly, that acceptance had been clear, and that departure had been smooth. They said the staff had stepped back as if taught by the room itself. They added that they had noted no incidents. I thanked them and set the phone face down, because sometimes gratitude is best when it rests. Inside the cabin, we moved to the living room and let the chairs decide the circle. Someone placed a bowl of oranges on the table, and their color felt like proof that winter knows how to keep a promise. A friend asked, in the generous way makers ask, whether I wanted to speak it out loud or let the night hold it for me. I said I wanted both, which was true. Messages continued, the way snow continues after you think it is finished. A cousin on my father's side wrote that a rumor about an intervention had surfaced like a chair scraping the floor. He said my grandmother had asked direct questions that did not allow detours, and that answers had been thin. He added that the words family concern had not convinced the people who watched me work every holiday in quiet corners. I smiled at the idea that truth sometimes chooses the most inconvenient audience. An uncle I barely see sent a brief note. He said that public correction teaches the wrong lesson, and that he had said so in the room. He added that my absence had forced everyone to speak to one another instead of speaking through me. I sat with that line and wondered how long I had served as a screen. Not every message was kind. A relative wrote that people had traveled a long way and that I had made the night difficult. She said that tradition mattered and that I had treated it like a toy. She added that my gifts had created a scene. I read it once, let the words pass over me like cold air, and did not answer. I had decided that not every invitation to a familiar fight deserved attendance. My brother's name flashed next. He wrote that numbers had been prepared to prove a point, and that they did not resemble math. He said he had watched the cufflinks closely and recognized the serif from our father's first business card, the one kept in a desk drawer like a relic. He added that a few people had looked at my mother as if a new light had been switched on. I imagined the study door, the leather chairs, the story that could be told with different punctuation. The cabin asked for nothing from me. It simply kept being itself. We played a quiet game where people tell two ordinary things they love and one that surprised them this year. My answers were tools, tea, and the way silence can perform a task better than any speech. Someone said that sounded like a workshop for feelings, and the room laughed the kind of laugh that does not wound. Later, a message came from the housekeeper, the one who always treated my work like work. She said staff had been told to leave my room alone until after the holiday. She added that she would keep an eye on my things and that the letter I sent had been logged properly. I thanked her and resisted the urge to fold gratitude into apology. I had learned that apology, when not needed, turns clear lines into fog. Near midnight, the snow thickened. I stepped outside with a blanket over my shoulders and listened to a world softened by weather. Somewhere, chairs were being moved back into place. Somewhere, a speech had been edited by events. Somewhere, a version of me had refused to be the lesson of the evening and had become the absence that taught it instead. When I returned to the fire, I wrote one sentence in my notebook. The portrait cracked and the wall did not fall. It was important to note both. I wanted to remember that progress can be a hairline line you only see when the light hits right. I added a second sentence. I did not have to hold the light. I only had to stop standing where it hurt me. My phone buzzed one last time. It was my grandmother, through a cousin's device because she prefers paper to glass. The message said she admired hands that learn a craft and that she would like to see my studio when the roads cleared. It added that she believed a family should be large enough to hold more than one definition of success. I felt my throat tighten, then loosen. I told the room that a door had opened far away and that I intended to walk through it when the snow allowed. We turned off the lights in stages. The cabin held our breathing and the soft tick of cooling pipes. Across town, a house sat with its center shifted a few inches toward true. I closed my eyes and let both places be real at once. The one that kept score, and the one that kept me. Morning arrived slow, like light deciding which boards of the floor to touch first. The cabin carried the hush of good sleep and the faint trace of last night's fire. I poured coffee and stood by the window while the snow rearranged the landscape into softer lines. My phone lay face down on the table. I turned it over only when the cup had warmed both hands. There it was, a subject line from the national retailer, the one I had answered before leaving the city. The message was clean and decisive. They confirmed the January meeting, attached a preliminary schedule, and in the last paragraph where important things sometimes hide, said their team wanted to increase the initial order and feature my capsule in their spring campaign as an emerging designer to watch. They used the kind of language that doesn't flinch. I read it twice, not because I doubted it, but because the words felt like wood that would hold a person's weight. I forwarded the email to my spring collection folder, added a calendar block for the meeting, and closed the screen. I didn't need to run around the room or narrate anything to anyone. Validation that fits arrives the way a well-made clasp closes. One sound, no strain. In the kitchen, my friends started the day with small tasks that matter. Slicing fruit, warming bread, finding the one mug that always feels like yours even in a cabinet full of others. I told them, in indirect words, that the spring plan had grown. They nodded and smiled the way makers do when they hear that a design is going to meet the world on honest terms. No one asked for numbers. They asked if I wanted more coffee. Between refills, messages began to stack. A boutique buyer wrote that a client had worn one of my pieces to the dinner and that 3 guests had asked for the designer's name. She said the request sounded like intent, not flattery. A small magazine emailed about a short feature on craft and meaning. They wanted a photo of hands in process rather than a portrait. I liked that choice. It felt like the story they actually wanted to tell. Then a longer message arrived from my brother. He said that the night had exposed the thinness of certain arguments and that he had paid attention to who listened and who only waited to speak. He wrote that he did not want to be another voice that told me how to live and asked instead whether I would show him my studio when I returned. He added that he had more to learn about the business side of design than he had understood. I breathed in and let the possibility take shape without rushing it into certainty. We decided to walk before the day gathered speed. The snow on the trail had the texture of sifted flour. The trees held their breath while we moved among them, and the sound of boots on packed powder became its own metronome. I thought about revenge and how the word used to mean spectacle to me. A reveal, a scene, a set of lines that made the room gasp. What I was living felt different. It felt like alignment. It felt like standing where my work could be seen without asking permission to exist. Back at the cabin, we made a late breakfast and let the table prove that abundance can be ordinary. I checked my phone once more and found a note from my grandmother through a cousin. She wanted to visit my studio when the roads cleared and asked, in her careful way, whether I had kept any early pieces. I smiled at the idea of placing those imperfect studies in her hands, not because they were flawless, but because they were honest. In the early afternoon, I opened my notebook and drew a new set of boxes. I wrote feature draft, sample timeline, studio visit plan, inventory check. I sketched the capsule pieces in the margin, simple silhouettes with small secrets, metal where it needed to be strong and air where it needed to feel like relief. I wrote down materials to source and the names of 2 assistants who could help without bending the line of quality I protect. A friend set a stack of plain postcards in front of me and said she had a ritual for new chapters. Write 1 sentence you want to remember when the noise returns. I wrote that proof does not need applause. Underneath, I added that boundaries look like doors because they are. By late afternoon, the delivery service sent a final report. All packages delivered, acknowledgements received, no issues to note. The clean brevity of it felt better than any dramatic retelling could have. I filed the email and put the phone away again. We spent the rest of the day in the kind of quiet that isn't empty. One person read, another mended a sweater, someone else drafted a plan for a spring garden. I sanded a small wooden ornament I had made the night before and inlaid a thin line of brass along its edge. It wasn't a product, it was a reminder that patience leaves a shine of its own. Near dusk, a text came from the housekeeper. She said the letter I sent had done its work. My room would be left intact until I arrived with an appointment. She added, in words that fit exactly, that she respected good tools and would keep an eye on mine. I thanked her and saved the message under records with a second copy in gratitude, a folder I hadn't named until that moment. Snow drifted again as night approached. We set the table with mismatched plates and candles burned down to a soft rim. Someone asked if I felt lighter. I said I felt accurate. I said that the story I had been telling myself about needing the right audience to matter had finally stepped out into the cold and closed the door behind it. The room hummed a small agreement you could feel more than hear. Before sleep, I looked once more at the retailer's email. I didn't need to reply again. I had already done the next right thing. I turned off the screen and stood by the window while the cabin settled. Proof sat in folders and on calendars, but it also sat in my chest, steady and quiet. I understood that the night my family had prepared for humiliation had become the night the work spoke for me. And in that speaking, I didn't need to raise my voice. By morning, the storm had thinned to a snowfall that looked like thought. I brewed coffee and let the cabin wake at its own pace. My phone blinked with messages I hadn't invited. I turned it over only when I felt steady enough to read without bracing. A cousin summarized the dinner as careful chaos. She said the room had tried to stitch itself back together, but the thread kept slipping. She added that people spoke softly, as if volume might shatter something that had already cracked. I pictured chairs angled in new ways, the choreography off by half a step, the portrait holding but changed. An aunt reported that the word intervention had met resistance it hadn't expected. She wrote that cousins questioned whether humiliation ever cured anything and that the explanation of concern sounded thin next to the box in each lap. She noted that the notes under the ribbons had reset the tone, not by accusation, but by meaning. I saved the message in records and felt my shoulders drop a fraction. A boutique owner texted that 3 inquiries had turned into orders overnight. She said guests had asked for the jeweler who writes with metal, and that the phrase had the shape of a tagline whether I wanted one or not. I smiled at the idea and reminded myself that language is only useful if it stays true. Then came my brother's email, longer than most. He wrote that he had watched the room measure itself and had noticed who grew quiet to listen. He admitted that the numbers prepared for the comparison felt like a story chosen first and calculated later. He asked to see my studio after the holidays and said he wanted to understand how design meets margin without losing soul. I put the laptop down and looked out at the snow until the urge to answer immediately passed. I wanted time to reply with care, not relief. A message from the housekeeper arrived next. She confirmed an appointment window for retrieving my things after the holiday and said the staff list had been updated to reflect that nothing in my room should be moved. She added a line about good tools deserving good hands. I filed it under records and gratitude because it belonged to both. Near noon, the retailer sent a short follow-up. Sample dates confirmed, photography window outlined, contracts attached for review. They used simple verbs. I forwarded the documents to my folder, printed 1 copy for markup, and felt that click in the chest again. The one that happens when a life aligns with its plans. We took a walk on the plowed road, the snowbank high and bright. I thought about how much of my energy used to be spent catching echoes in rooms that never meant to hear me. Now echoes arrived without pursuit, carrying other people's sudden honesty and my own quiet confirmations. Revenge, I realized, was no longer a scene to stage. It was the absence of begging combined with the presence of proof. Back at the cabin, we made soup and ate standing around the island. A friend asked if I felt vindicated. I said I felt accurate. I said accuracy was heavier and kinder than triumph. The room accepted those words the way it accepted steam from the pot, rising, dispersing, warming the air. Late afternoon brought one last message from a relative who rarely used my name. She wrote that tradition matters, but that tradition without respect is only repetition. She added that the bracelet sat right on her wrist and that this detail surprised her. I read it once and let it land without building a speech around it. As evening settled, I closed the laptop and the folder at the same time. The day had delivered what it owed, and nothing more. I did not need to scroll for confirmation. I stood by the window and watched the snow soften the edges of the world, then wrote a single line in my notebook. The echoes found me. I did not go looking. The next day, I spread documents across the cabin table the way I spread metal on a bench, flat, visible, ready for decisions. The retailer's packet was clean: production calendar, photo window, terms that respected both craft and time. I read every line slowly, marked questions in the margins, and circled 2 clauses that needed a firmer sentence. I reminded myself that clarity is respect on paper. I emailed the brand's coordinator with 3 tidy points. I kept the tone professional and warm, asked for a modest deposit aligned to materials, and outlined the maximum batch size that would keep quality from bending. The reply arrived with the steadiness I had been practicing. They agreed to the deposit, adjusted timelines by a week, and added that their campaign team wanted process footage, hands, tools, flame, not staged portraits. The ask sounded like comprehension, not marketing. I said yes. After breakfast, I opened my notebook and drew a studio map. I measured the space I had and the space I would need if the order grew again. I listed equipment that earns its keep and equipment that only looks busy. I wrote 2 names under assistants with hours and rates I could honor. I added a third name under overflow for finishing work if the schedule tightened. Planning did not feel like fear anymore. It felt like kindness to the future. A small magazine followed up about the feature. They wanted to shoot in the studio, to show solder lines and the moment before metal remembers it can move. They asked for a paragraph about why I design the way I do. I typed that I make pieces that carry quiet meanings, strength where pressure lives, air where breath is needed, a clasp that holds without bruising. I did not add anything about revenge. The work already knew. I checked inventory with the same attention I give to breath when a flame is near chain. Stones were sorted by color and cut, metal by gauge and origin, findings labeled in a handwriting that looks like my grandmother's on grocery lists. I plotted orders backward from the ship date and placed supply calls with vendors who answer the phone like partners. One asked if I was finally ready to upgrade a torch. I said I was, and scheduled delivery. Progress sometimes looks like heat you can trust. By afternoon, the cabin felt like a temporary office that had chosen comfort. A friend read contracts aloud in plain words so I could hear what my eyes might skip. Another checked that the printer had ink before I needed it. Care appeared as small logistics that kept the day honest. I thought again about the word revenge and how here it had become a synonym for alignment. As light angled low, my brother's email waited with patient subject lines. I answered with measured generosity. I wrote that he could visit the studio when I was back, that he would see numbers that looked like craft rather than spectacle, and that margin in design is both mathematics and mercy. I did not try to convert him. I offered a chair and a clear table. I closed the laptop and stepped outside. The snow had thinned to glitter in the air. I held the day up to the light the way I hold a finished clasp, checking for burrs, testing the hinge, making sure the click is clean. Everything held. The order, the schedule, the help I would hire, the boundary I had kept. Proof lived in emails and calendars, but also in how my shoulders sat lower without asking permission. Back inside, I filed the contracts, labeled a new folder campaign assets, and penciled the first studio day after the holiday. I turned down the last page of my notebook where I keep one-line truths and wrote, "Build the life at the pace of quality." I let the ink dry before closing the cover. The room warmed itself around us. Soup on the stove, quiet music, the soft conversation of people who don't need to be convinced to be kind. I felt the shape of the coming weeks settle in my hands like a tool I already knew how to hold. The night my parents had prepared for my correction had become the day my work corrected the story. I didn't need applause. I needed light, paper, and time. And I had all three. I drove back to the city with the road salted and the sky the color of a quiet slate. The appointment to retrieve my things was set for late morning. I wore pockets that could hold lists and a mind that could hold only what mattered. The letter had done its work. I would be met by staff, not strategy. The house looked the same from the street. Perfect angles, perfect wreaths, a performance that kept its posture after the audience goes home. Inside, the housekeeper greeted me with the respect that makes formality unnecessary. She said in indirect words that my room had been left as it was and that the log showed my time window. I thanked her and followed the familiar hallway that still knew the weight of my steps. My old room held the soft dust of paused years. I opened the closet and found dresses that belonged to versions of me I no longer wore. I set aside a handful for fabric I could repurpose in the studio, a lining for a display tray, a ribbon for packaging that tells a truer story. The rest went in a donation bag. I heard my mother's preference for labels in my head and chose plain paper instead. On the desk, my journals sat in a stack that looked like a spine. I slid rubber bands around each year and placed them in a box I had labeled words. Early sketchbooks followed, faces of metalwork that still surprised me with their clumsy honesty. I packed them under studies because that's what they were, lessons that had become hands. In the drawer lay my first tools: a cheap torch, a worn file, pliers with grips that remembered the shape of my worry. I held them the way people hold photographs, then wrapped each in cloth and set them in a case I had brought just for this. Tools age like elders. You keep them near, so you remember how you learned. The photo albums waited on a lower shelf. I turned a few pages and let images pass like weather. the beach photo, the school ceremony, a smile that knew how to be useful. I chose 3 albums and left the rest for a later day when nostalgia would not be confused with debt. At one point, the housekeeper returned with a small tray and said, in careful tone, that a box had been found in storage with my name on it. Inside lay a handful of clay pendants from a school project and a note in a younger hand that said, "Keep making." I decided that was the only sentence I needed from this building. I slipped the note into words and felt the box grow lighter. I moved efficiently, like someone who knows a room can turn at any moment. It didn't. The house stayed still. Downstairs, I heard the quiet activity of a staff restoring a stage. No one came to watch me pack the props I had outgrown. Before I closed the final box, I walked to the window and looked at the yard where we once played a game that didn't require scoring. I told myself that leaving was not erasing, it was tracing the right outline. I wrote a short receipt for what I had taken and left a copy with the housekeeper, who nodded like a notary of ordinary truths. At the door, she said she liked good tools and that she was glad mine had found my hands again. I smiled and answered that care is also a tool and that she had used hers well. We understood each other without needing a longer conversation. I loaded the car and checked the labels: words, studies, tools, photos, fabric. It looked like a small inventory of a beginning. On the passenger seat, I placed the index card that had steadied me all week. I didn't need its sentences now, but I kept it there the way a jeweler keeps a loop close. Ready, not urgent. As I pulled away, my phone buzzed once. A short message from my brother said he would be in the city next week and asked if the studio visit still stood. I answered yes and added that he would need to wear clothes he wouldn't mind getting a little scorched. He replied with a line that sounded like willingness. I let that be enough for the drive home. Back in my apartment, I stacked the boxes by the studio bench. The room took them in like new material. What I had taken were the pieces of a story I could still use. What I had left were the sets and costumes. A life is lighter without those. Back in my studio, January light fell across the bench the way a good clasp closes. One clean sound. No struggle. Boxes from the house sat stacked by the wall with labels that told the truth. Words, studies, tools, photos, fabric. I opened them slowly over days, the way you open memory without letting it spill. Nothing in those boxes asked me to perform. Everything asked me to work. I set the old torch on a shelf where I keep things that taught me patience. I filed the early sketches under a tab called Origins. I slipped the school note that said "Keep making" behind the glass of a small frame near the drill press. I wanted that sentence where heat and noise live, not on a quiet mantle that forgets what it means. The retailer's timeline lived on the wall in tidy blocks. Materials were ordered, delivery dates confirmed, photography booked for the week when light usually behaves. I hired 2 assistants for careful hours and set a rule everyone could hold: quality over hurry, breath over noise. The room changed shape to fit the work that was coming, and the work agreed. My brother visited on a gray afternoon that smelled like snow. He said in indirect words that he was ready to watch and learn. I handed him safety glasses and a task that would introduce respect: polishing edges until metal stops arguing with skin. He noticed that nothing about the process was casual, not even the way we put tools down. He asked about margin like someone who meant it. I answered in numbers and in choices because both are true. We didn't resolve a family. We completed a task. It was enough for one day. Messages with my parents became brief and factual. I did not audition for understanding. I replied when information was needed and let silence do the rest. My grandmother wrote on paper that her driver would bring her when the sidewalks cleared. I pictured her hands on the older pieces and felt a steadiness rise that no praise had ever built in me. Work filled the hours the way tide fills a shoreline, predictable, strong, not asking permission. I kept the studio warm and the calendar honest. Orders moved from list to tray to box to label. I learned the new torch's breath and adjusted my own to match it. At night, I wrote one line in the notebook and closed it before legacy could turn into performance. Sometimes I thought about the dinner I did not attend. I imagined chairs set back in their places and a room telling itself the story it preferred. I did not need to correct it. My correction had already happened in the only language I trust: decisions kept, boundaries held, work done right. When the campaign team arrived, they asked for hands, tools, and flame. We gave them exactly that. The photographer asked what story I wanted the pictures to tell. I said, in simple words, that metal remembers pressure and so do people, and that both can be shaped without breaking if heat is used with care. He nodded as if he had watched that happen before. As the day ended, I stood in the doorway and looked at the room I had rebuilt in plain sight. The revenge my family witnessed on Christmas was never about spectacle. It was a line I drew and walked without raising my voice. It was proof that stayed true once the room got quiet. If this story found you at the right time, tell me where you're watching from. Tap like to help it reach someone who needs steadiness tonight, and subscribe if you want more stories about boundaries, craft, and choosing your own table. And if you've ever turned humiliation into a plan, share your line in the comments. Someone will breathe easier because you wrote it.